Welcome back. I it's been a while since I've been able to do one of these videos, so I'm going to try to break these down a little bit shorter instead of trying to do so many slides and trying to do it over 10 minutes. I'm going to try to break this down so it's easier to watch and focus a little bit more on the topics itself. So for this video on the Sacrament of Marriage, I'm going to focus mostly just on what the sacrament is. And then in the next video, I'll talk about annulments because there's a lot of confusion as to what exactly is an annulment. Some people think it's the Catholic equivalent of divorce, but really it isn't. So let's begin. This was one of the cartoons I used to show in class all the time. I actually know this cartoonist. I've been blessed to be able to get to know him over the last few years. And I've told him I used a lot of his cartoons in my class. Anyway, so we've talked about the journey that we all go through, the 4 different points of life that we all share, assuming we live a long life. We're born, we grow up, we work, and then we prepare for death. And along the way, the sacraments fit into those 4 different points of life. So birth with baptism, growth with confirmation, and now we're going to look at the sacraments of work, which is the sacraments of holy orders and marriage. But we're going to focus on marriage first of all. So one of the things we have to remember is what the sign that is occurring when marriage happens. And this comes from Ephesians 5:25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her. So the sign that's happening in marriage is the bridegroom and the bride. The husband laying down his life for the bride, just as Christ laid down his life for his bride, the church. So again, bridegroom and bride. And Christ refers to himself as a bridegroom. We hear this throughout the New Testament. When the apostles of John come up and, why aren't your disciples fasting like John the Baptist are? To which Jesus says, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? And then you hear another parable about the master who's long overdue and the virgins that are waiting for it, and the bridegroom that's long waited. And once he arrives, they come in and enter into the wedding feast. But again, this kind of goes into what Ephesians is saying, the idea that the husbands should love their wives just as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her to make her holy. So what's needed for the sacrament of marriage? This is kind of a different thing. A lot of people don't realize it doesn't have to be 2 Catholics. They both have to be baptized, whether it's 2 Catholics, a Catholic and a Methodist. As long as we recognize the baptism as being valid, we recognize the sacrament as being valid between 2 baptized Christians who are free to enter into marriage, who give their consent basically through the exchange of vows, the marital vows, before the witnesses, and for lack of a better word, they consummate the marriage. In other words, sex. So, another good cartoon I used to always show. Kids never understood, why can't we get married outside? Why can't we do this on a beach? Why can't we go to a remote location, go to the Caribbean to get married? But the idea of it is, this is a vocation that you're answering, that the Lord has given to you, and it's one of the reasons why we do it in the church. But this kind of goes back again to the idea of sex. What is the purpose of sex? One of these days I want to do a video on Humani Vitae, which is Paul VI's document on human life. But the idea of sex is that it's meant to be a total gift of self between the husband and wife, holding nothing back. And 2 purposes within sex is the unity of the spouses and the possibility of creating life. Now, because of this, there are a few things that can never be permitted. Because it's procreative, it doesn't mean every time one has sex that it's going to lead to life, but you have to be open to the creation of life. And because of that, you can never have homosexual sex. It's not saying we'll come back to that. But the idea of it also is that sex is meant for marriage, so therefore it's not meant to be used before the marriage, because again, births out of wedlock, and that's not what Christ wanted. And also because of the two purposes of sex, unitive and procreative, contraception's forbidden, because that always blocks the possibility of life. Again, the idea that you're supposed to give a total gift of yourself. I'm giving you my everything except my fertility. So it's important to understand these two purposes for sex, because it really does play into marriage and what the purpose of marriage is. But the idea of premarital sex, we're not meant to sleep around with everything that's possible. And we see how that is so with STDs, because as the old saying goes, it's still true today that God always forgives, mankind sometimes forgives, but nature never forgives. And the idea that we start sleeping with everything, that's where nature starts to rebel. That's where diseases come in. But so what's needed for the sacrament of marriage? Again, it has to be between either two baptized Christians, two baptized Catholics, a baptized Catholic and a baptized non-Catholic, or between two baptized non-Catholics. So I think, yeah. So again, it has to be between two Catholics, a Catholic and a Lutheran, or a Lutheran and a Methodist. As long as both parties are baptized, we recognize the marriage as being valid. And you have to be free to enter into marriage. So you cannot be forced to enter into marriage. You have to freely choose to do this. And this is going to come back with some of the impediments that we'll talk about that can prevent the marriage from occurring. The other thing too, the old saying was shotgun weddings. You got my daughter pregnant, you're going to marry her, make an honest woman of her. Well, that's not freely entering into marriage without fear or coercion. So you can't get married because of that. And actually, if that's the reason you're going to get married in the church probably will say, let's wait a bit. Let's make sure that you're entering into this with the right intention. So the word that I've been using a lot already is impediment. And basically, an impediment is something that renders a person unqualified, incapable, unable of entry into a marriage validly. And most of these can be dispensed from the bishop, and we'll look at a few of these. So examples would be, and you have to remember circumstances change everything. This is examples of impediments that apply to the Church Universal. So in this country, in the United States, it's very rare where somebody that's under 16 will get married. But again, this is the idea of the universal law of the church. So in some places where marriages do happen at a younger age, men have to be at least 16 years of age, women have to be at least 14. This is something that could be dispensed. Again, it has to have a good reason. Another example of an impediment would be like myself. I have been ordained to the priesthood. I've taken the promise of celibacy. I'm incapable of entering into a marriage. Now, if I was to leave the priesthood, which I never will do, if I was to leave, though, like Father Jonathan Morris from Fox News, he would be dispensed. He would have to apply for dispensation from his vows, and if they were granted, then he would be able to enter into a marriage. And the same thing applies with sisters, religious vows. The sisters that take perpetual vows. And a lot of times, again, that includes the vow of celibacy. So, but mixed marriages is also an impediment, but that's something that can be dispensed from. Basically, a mixed marriage would be between a baptized Catholic and a baptized non-Catholic. And there's a few requirements that the Catholic party has to make for the marriage to be permitted, to allow the dispensation to be granted. The Catholic has to promise that they're going to keep their faith. That just because they're marrying a non-Catholic doesn't mean that they're going to go to church, their church one weekend and then their spouse's church the other. My great-grandmother Miller was an Irish Catholic. She married a non-Catholic, and the non-Catholic made sure that her boys, my grandfather, got to church every week, got to mass every week. So you have to make sure that you're going to keep the the Catholic party's faith solid, and you have to promise to raise the kids Catholic. Again, that's probably something that's unpopular, but the idea is if you want to be married in the Catholic Church, you're going to want to keep your faith, and we believe that the church is the true church from Christ, and we want to keep the kids in the faith. So again, that doesn't mean you rotate between churches. You go to the Catholic Church one weekend and the Baptist Church the next. So this actually comes from canon law, which is the law that applies to all Catholics. I'm not a canon lawyer, so I went to the seminary to study theology for 4 years, but then there are others that will be sent on to do further studies, and some of them are sent to become a canon lawyer, which is focused study the law of the church. Anyway, the Canon 1125 states that the Catholic party declares that he or she is prepared to remove any dangers of falling away from the faith, and makes a sincere promise to do all in his or her power in order that the children be baptized and brought up in the Catholic Church. So when you are preparing to marry, you really have to mean it. I had one case where I had met with the couple a few times. I think it was one's Catholic, the other's not. And after the third time, the Catholic party couldn't decide whether they were going to bring the kids up Catholic or not. And when I said, if you can't do this, we can't do the marriage. And the next words were, yes, we'll do it. It's like, mean it. So, again, this is what a priest goes to the seminary for anywhere between 6 and 8 years to prepare for this vocation. A married couple will go through maybe under a dozen sessions between the priest or a married couple to go over the focus results. So, but the promise that the Catholic party has to make is that I reaffirm my faith in Jesus Christ, and with God's help intend to continue living that faith in the Catholic Church. I promise to do all in my power to share the faith I have received with our children by having them baptized and raised as Catholics. And that comes from the marriage prep form that one goes through, where we acquire, the information, that the person's names, their date of birth, their date of baptism, their place where they were baptized, so on and so on. Then you do the prenuptial questionnaire, and then if there's anything that needs to be applied for dispensation-wise, then this would be one of those that's on there where the Catholic party would reaffirm their faith and that they're going to, with God's help, continue to live in that faith. And then the paper would be sent to the chancery to get the bishop's dispensation so that the marriage can happen. But there are other examples of the impediment. A lot of these are kind of fun just to look at because they don't happen very often, but they have. I like to refer to a lot of these as the Hallmark Channel examples. So the impediment of crime, you kill the spouse of the person you want to marry because you want to marry them. So Joe is in the way of allowing me to be married to Allison. I'm going to bump off Joe so that Allison will now be free to marry. Well, that's an impediment of crime. Infinity, mother-in-law and a son-in-law. Let's say that the husband's wife dies and then he falls in love with her mother. Or the husband dies and then the wife falls in love with the son's father or the husband's father. Again, very rare, but it has happened. I really don't know when, but I mean, it is in the law of the church, so I'm assuming that it has happened. This idea of the impediment of abduction is definitely the Hallmark Channel. One who kidnaps the person they want to marry against their will. I think that there's a number of Hallmark movies that have been made about that, where the person's kidnapped and then they end up falling in love and live happily ever after. Well, can't do that. Now, homosexual marriage, and I put marriage in quotations because we don't recognize it as marriage. And the thing that we have to realize is we do not condemn people for being homosexual. We do not. But we do not condone the activity, the the action itself. So if, I hate saying it this way, but love the sinner, hate the sin. We can't condone something that is intrinsically evil, and it's not saying that somebody that's homosexual is intrinsically evil, but the desire to do it would be. And that's one of the reasons we cannot permit homosexual marriage to occur, because again, even though it is unitive, I mean, two people that love each other show their love through a gift of self, or um, homosexual activity is never capable of being life-giving. It's never able to result in procreation, the creation of a new life. And again, we can never separate those two purposes from the marital act, the idea of unity and procreation. So again, it's not meant to be that like the church is being mean or anything, but we really do take this seriously. That's one of the reasons why Jesus says this is why a man leaves his mother and father and is joined to his wife, and the two become one. And we'll talk about that in a bit. That's the sacramental bond. Now, there are things that can never ever be dispensed from. Consanguinity, basically relations of blood. So, yeah. First cousins can never get married. Second cousins can, but it has to be dispensed. I think I've only known one person in my entire life that married their second cousin. But an aunt and a nephew, grand uncle and a niece, uncle and a niece, brother and a sister can never get married. I've seen the stories. It sounds like the Maury Povich example of a long lost brother and a sister who are in love with each other, and then they discovered that they're brother and sister. Again, you. But the other example would be a prior bond, and this is one that we will spend a little bit more time in the next video. But a prior bond would be an undissolved prior marriage. In other words, that one was married in the church and that there was a sacramental bond that was formed. And as long as the bond remains, one is not free to enter into a new marriage. Basically, annulment is stating that there's no bond that was established, and we'll talk about that again. So, a marriage can still be valid if it's between a Catholic and a non-baptized. Now, the big difference is this would not be a sacramental marriage. It would be considered to be a natural marriage. The sacramental marriage, again, is between two who are baptized, regardless of their denomination. But a marriage between a Catholic and a non-baptized can occur, but you still have to get the dispensation for this. So for the matter of the sacrament of marriage, as we said, baptized man, baptized woman, we recognize the baptisms of almost every denomination within the church or within Christianity. And part of the reason, again, is remember the imagery of marriage is Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. Christ that lays down his life for the church, his bride. And it's one of the reasons the church is always referred to as a mother, Holy Mother Church. So, we already did that. The form of the sacrament would be the vows of consent. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but, we do not allow people to come up with their own vows, to be able to write their own vows of commitment to the other. And this kind of goes along with this slide here. It is the biggest day of your life, but it's not all about you. The same thing is true. Why can't we be married on the beach? Why can't we get married at sunset? And God is present everywhere, but this is a vocational sacrament. You're entering into the vocation that God has called you two from the very first moment of your existence. And this needs to be done in the house of God, before the community of God. And yes, again, God is present everywhere. And in some circumstances, we do Mass outside, like at summer camp or vacation or whatever it is, outdoor Masses, especially during these times. Hopefully, when we're allowed to do Mass in the public again, I have a feeling we might do some outdoor Masses. But vocational sacraments are done within the church. And the same thing is true with the priesthood. We're ordained at the cathedral. We're ordained at a church. So, part of the reason, too, is the church is consecrated. And the other thing to remember is Christ is truly present there. And the reason I say that is because he's truly present in the Eucharist, that's in the tabernacle, that's in the church, that the wedding is being performed at. So, and again, this idea that marriage is a covenant that you're entering into with God. So, it is a vocation, it is a lifelong vocation that one enters into until death. And while we are able to do other Masses, as I just said, outside, the sacraments of vocation, whether it's baptism, and again, circumstances can change on that, but confirmation, marriage, holy orders, they're to be celebrated within the house of God, within the worship space of the community of God. And as I just already said, I guess I just jumped ahead of myself, but most important part is two people standing in the presence of their family and in the presence of God. In the true presence of God, truly present in the tabernacle and the Eucharist, of being able to say, I do. Now, the vows that one is promising and committing to is fidelity, that you're entering into a marriage for life between you and your spouse and nobody else. So, in other words, you're promising to be faithful for the rest of your life. You're not going to have an affair. And that goes along with the second point. You're entering into an indissoluble marriage. The marriage lasts until the death of one of the spouses. And both of you are open to having kids. So if you're not open to having kids, that gets to be a serious problem. And that's something we're going to address in the next video as well. But that's why we say all three have to be there. And it's also one of the reasons why we don't allow prenuptial agreements. Because the idea of the prenuptial agreement is if the marriage fails. See, you're promising to enter into marriage until death, but a prenup saying if. There might be a possibility. But again, we are preparing you for marriage for life, and that there are no ifs. What if the marriage fails? We plan to enter into marriage for the rest of your life. So the idea of an agreement is if this should fail, then this is what's going to happen. And as I always use the example, I get the house and you get the dog. So it goes against the idea of the indissolubility of marriage. Now, the vows would be, you have come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage. I have to look up this in the the sacramentary or the missal, because it has been a few years since I've done this, and in the time since I've done this, I know that the wedding rite translation has changed, but this is the words that we will have been familiar with. You have come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage. In other words, you're doing this of your own free will, and you're not being forced. You're not doing this because you're being forced, or that there's no other choice. Again, you're entering into this freely. And that you're promising to do this for the rest of your life. Will you honor and love each other as man and wife for the rest of your lives? Will you accept children lovingly from God and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? So again, the idea that one never ever wants to have a kid, but then they're going to say, will you accept children lovingly from God? I do. Well, there's the contradiction. And that's one of the things that could prevent a marriage from occurring, a sacramental marriage from occurring. So the priest would then say, since it is your intention to enter into marriage, join your right hands and declare your consent before God and his church. And this would be the form here. I take you to be my wife. I promise to be true to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. I will love you and honor you all the days of my life. I have a typo there. Oops. So the minister of marriage is the couple. They're the ones that exchange the sacrament, that gives the sacrament to each other. The only reason that the priest is there is to witness the marriage on behalf of the church and to bless the marriage on behalf of the church. So he receives the vows and blesses the marriage. So the priest will then say, you have declared your consent before the church. May the Lord in his goodness strengthen your consent and fill you both with his blessings. And key words here, what God has joined, men must not divide. So this is one of the things that always blows me away, because these are the words of Christ. What God has joined, no one should separate. Yet in other denominations, remarriage is not a problem. Well, we'll come back to that. So, again, what's needed for a marriage? A sacramental marriage? Baptized man, baptized woman, free to enter into marriage, who pledge unity, indissolubility, and openness to children. So, the effects of marriage, basically, as all the sacraments, remember, a sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So you receive an increase of sanctifying grace. An unbreakable marriage bond is established, and it supplies the grace to be able to perfect the love between the couples and to help each other to achieve holiness and salvation, because really, in the end, it is going to be a shame if you end up in heaven and your spouse ends up in hell. So the purpose is to stress the bond that is formed, and this gets into the sacramental bond that we talk about. And this is what I'm going to talk about in the next video, the idea of annulments, because what God has joined, let no one break. And as Catholics, we're required to follow the laws of the church when it comes to being married. So we'll come into that. So we look at the two before marriage. As I used to use this example, you have a blue ball and a yellow ball. Blue ball represents men. Yellow ball represents the woman. After marriage, the unbreakable bond is established. And again, this comes from Matthew 19:6. They're no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, no human being must separate. So an unbreakable sacramental bond is established until the death of one of the spouses. So you can't break the one flesh. And this is why, again, it blows me away in other denominations how they can have remarriage. Because it goes against the very words of Christ himself. What God has joined together, no human being must separate. But what about annulments? Well, we're going to go into that the next video. This comes from, again, Matthew 19:14-6. Have you not read from the beginning that the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh? So they're no longer two but one. And then, as I was just saying, what God has joined, no human being must separate. So, and the thing is, he takes it back. You know, the Jews complain, well, why did Moses allow us to have divorce then? And Jesus said it was because of the hardness of your hearts. But from the beginning, it was not so. He takes it back to the beginning. Again, in Genesis 2:24, where it says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife and becomes one flesh. So what happens in Matthew 19:4-6 goes back to Genesis. And I believe, have you not read from the beginning? So the original purpose for marriage was that a man is joined to his wife and they become one. So, and this is something that is stressed throughout the New Testament. What God has joined, no one must separate. So again, Matthew 19:6, taking it back to Genesis 2:24, and in Matthew's Gospel it's also reiterated. So the sacramental bond cannot be dissolved by anybody in heaven and on earth. This is why not even the Pope can break a sacramental bond. So it's only broken by death. And an annulment is looking at something that might have prevented the bond from occurring. And like I said, that's going to be the topic of the next video. So, purpose of marriage, again, would be the good of the spouses, focusing on the good of the whole, of the other, and the good of children. So, the idea of procreation, bringing up kids, and educating them in the faith. And we do the best that we can with CCD or the Catholic schools, but the home is the first church in the school because it's from the parents that their kids will learn who Jesus Christ is and what it is to be a Christian, how to pray, and that Jesus is God and not something to be yelled when somebody gets angry or is in pain. So, and we'll just finish up with this. So after the marriage ceremony, usually a certificate will be issued, and basically stating that at this church, so and so were married on a date according to the rite of the Roman Catholic Church in the state of whatever by the priest who's officiating, whether it's a priest, deacon, or bishop, and the presence of the witnesses, and as appears in the marriage register of the church. So it's entered. If you were baptized at a different parish from where you were married, that parish where you are married would send a letter to your baptismal parish saying to update your baptismal records to show that on such a date you entered into the sacrament of marriage. So this is one of the reasons why, too, when a couple is preparing to be married, they have to ask for an updated baptismal certificate because your baptismal parish will have the baptismal records. Like I said, it's like a doctor's office that show you what sacraments you have received. So if you've never been married before, it will show that you're free to enter into marriage. But if you were married before and the marriage was not annulled, then you're incapable of entering into marriage until that spouse dies. So hopefully this has been helpful. Kind of went over it a little fast, but like I said, I'm trying to keep these videos short so that it's easier to watch. I'm going to try to film a little bit later today the video on annulments and what can cause an annulment to happen or what could prevent an annulment from happening. So again, make sure you like the video. Please share and subscribe. And until next time, God bless.